The horses stopped before he did. That was the first thing. The way both animals locked their legs in the same instant, ears pinned flat, nostrils flaring wide as the rim of a lantern. Caleb Dre had ridden these two horses for 11 years across country that would break most men down to their bare bones, and in all that time, neither animal had ever refused him without cause. He sat still in the saddle and let the silence do the talking. There was nothing to see. The canyon ahead curved south into shadow, red walls climbing 50 feet on either side, the late afternoon light the color of an old bruise along the upper ledges. Behind him, the flat hard pan stretched back 3 miles to the last water hole, the one he'd left nearly dry by his own hand. Ahead, the canyon narrowed. The horses would not move. He did not spur them. He did not speak. He only listened to the sound the desert makes when something living moves through it, a sound that is not quite silence, not quite breath, but something suspended between the two. Then, from somewhere above the south rim, a single stone skipped loose and fell. Caleb did not look up right away. A man who looks up too fast in canyon country tells the watching things exactly what he knows. Instead, he tilted his hat brim against the sun as though studying the trail ahead, and only then let his eyes trace slowly upward along the rock face. Nothing moved, but something had. He turned the horses back the way he'd come, slowly, unhurried, the way a man rides when he wants the world to believe he has nowhere urgent to be. And he did not breathe fully again until the canyon mouth was 200 yards behind him and the open flat lay wide and unbroken in every direction. Whatever was on that rim had not followed. Not yet.
3 days earlier, Caleb Dre had not expected to be anywhere near the Perdido Basin. He was a contract rider out of Tucson, not a lawman, not a soldier, and not the kind of man given to explaining himself to strangers. He carried a single-action Colt on his right hip and a skinning knife on his left, and he had learned early in life that the distance between the living and the dead in this country was rarely measured in miles. It was measured in decisions, small ones mostly, the kind a man makes before he's had time to think them all the way through. He'd been moving south toward the border, carrying a surveyor's satchel for a land company out of El Paso, documents, charts, nothing that would get a man killed, or so he'd been told. The pay was fair, and the timeline was loose, which suited him. He'd ridden out of Benson on a Tuesday morning, with 2 weeks' water and supply, and a route that kept him clear of the main trails, clear of the mining camps, and clear of the kind of company a man doesn't choose but finds anyway. The ranch had not been on his route. He'd seen the smoke first, a thin gray column rising straight up in the heat-stilled air south of the Rincon foothills. Smoke like that, vertical and slow, usually meant a cook fire or a signal. Fire that spread and rolled meant something else. He'd ridden toward it because a man alone in this country who ignores another man's smoke has already decided something about himself, and Caleb had not yet made that decision. The ranch was a modest thing, a main house of adobe brick, a low stable, a circular corral made of ocotillo posts and wire, and a well with a wooden cover near the south corner of the yard. The smoke was coming from the chimney, not from any disaster, and as he rode in through the open gate, a woman appeared in the doorway of the house with a rifle held loosely in the crook of her arm. She watched him ride to the well and stop, and she did not lower the rifle. "I'm just passing through," he said, "looking to water my animals and fill my canteens. I'll pay if there's a price." She studied him for a long moment. She was perhaps 45, lean as rawhide, with dark eyes that moved the way experienced eyes move, checking distance and angle and threat before anything else. "Water's not for sale in this country. It's given or it isn't." She told him the well was low. She said this without apology, as a fact, the way a person who lives by facts always speaks them. She said there hadn't been rain in 41 days, and the creek 2 miles east had gone to sand 3 weeks prior. "Take what you need," she said. "I've got enough." He watered both horses first. They drank long and slow, the way animals drank when they have been patient with thirst. Then he lowered the bucket twice for himself and filled his 3 canteens and his tin cooking pot. By the time he was done, the water level in the well had dropped a visible hand's width. He looked at what he'd taken and felt the particular weight of it. "You sure you're not running short?" he asked. "I told you what I told you," she said. She had, but the second man changed things. He came from the stable, not the woman's kin, not the look of him. He was young, 19 or 20, Mexican, with a badly wrapped wound on his left forearm that had gone to fever 2 days prior from the smell of it. He moved into the yard slow and apologetic, the way people move when they feel themselves to be a burden, and he looked at the well the way a man looks at something he has already cost more than he intended. His name was Tomas. He'd come to the ranch 3 days ahead of Caleb, on foot, with nothing. He said he'd been working a mining claim north of the Chiricahuas with 3 other men when riders came in the night and ran them off. He said he'd run for 2 days straight, and that 2 of the other men had not run at all, which was a way of saying what it was a way of saying. He said the men who'd come were 6 or 7 strong, riding in a loose formation, and that they'd stripped the claim of tools and mules and moved on south. The woman, her name was Vera Hollis, she said, as though the name had weight she wasn't giving away for free, had taken Tomas in because she was that kind of woman, not from naivety, from principle, which is a harder thing to shake. Caleb had been about to ride on. He looked at the young man's arm, he looked at the well. He thought about the surveyor's satchel on his pack saddle, which needed to reach El Paso in 10 days, and about the route south that ran through the Perdido Basin, and about the riders Tomas had described, who moved fast and south and didn't leave witnesses behind them if they could help it. He unsaddled his horses. "I'll stay the night," he said. "Give that arm a proper look." The arm needed more than a look. He spent the better part of the afternoon cleaning the wound with the last of the whiskey from his kit and rebinding it with clean cloth torn from his spare shirt. He'd seen enough infected wounds to know when one had passed the point of no return, and this one had not quite, though it was close enough to the edge that another day would have settled the question permanently. The young man sat still through the entire process and did not make a sound, which told Caleb something about where he came from and what his life had required of him. That evening, the 3 of them ate a spare meal of dried beans and salt pork and Vera's flatbread baked on the iron skillet, and the woman asked no questions and offered no conversation that went deeper than the practical, which suited the mood. The desert dark came fast and total, the stars unreal in their abundance above the flat, and Caleb took his blankets to the stable and listened to the horses breathe and thought about the riders Tomas had described. He was not worried. He was something quieter than worried. He was paying attention. He was not yet aware that there were men, even then, somewhere in the dark hills to the west, who were paying attention too. He found the first track the next morning, 20 feet past the gate. It was a single horse print, pressed deep in the damp soil near the base of the fence post where the shadow had kept the ground cool and yielding. The print was unshod, not a working horse, and it had been made in the night, which meant someone had ridden close enough to the fence line to leave a mark while the 3 of them slept. He did not mention it to the others at first. He walked the perimeter of the yard in a slow circuit, the way you walk when you're looking at a landscape and not at anything in particular, and he found 2 more prints at the south end of the corral and a place where a rider had stopped long enough for the horse to shift its weight twice, the toe impression set half an inch deeper from the rocking motion. Someone had stood at the south fence in the middle of the night and watched the house. He came back in for coffee and sat across from Vera and put the information before her plain, without softness, because she was the kind of woman who would rather be told the hard thing clearly than the soft thing gently. She did not react the way he expected. She looked at her cup for a long moment, and then she said, "How many horses?" "1 that I found. Maybe more further out." "That's how they work," she said. "One comes in close, the rest stay back." He looked at her carefully. "You know who they are?" "I know who they might be," she said. "There's a man named Cutter Voss. He runs a loose band, raiders mostly, claim jumpers sometimes.
They've been moving through this basin for the last month. The Beaumont Ranch, 12 miles north, they found it empty 3 weeks ago. The family gone. No bodies, no note. She paused. The Kellermans, south of here, same thing, 2 weeks ago. Caleb sat with that. Gone how? Nobody knows, she said it quietly. Could have run, could have been taken, could be a number of things. And nobody's come to look. She shook her head once. We're a long way from anyone who looks. He knew this. He had always known this about this country. It was not a secret. It was simply a condition of living here, that the distance between any man and any law was vast enough that what happened in between was governed by other principles entirely, by what a man was willing to do and what he was willing to endure, and what he believed about himself when there was no one watching but the desert. Tomas had heard them from the doorway. He stood there with his bandaged arm held close to his chest and said in a voice that was steady but careful, "The men who came to the claim, one of them had a very pale scar here." He drew a line down his own cheek with one finger. "I heard the others call him Voss." The name settled into the room like a stone dropped in still water.
Caleb told himself he would ride out by midday. He had a contract, a deadline, and a route, and none of those things included standing between Cutter Voss and whatever it was Cutter Voss wanted. He had no stake in this ranch. He had no obligation beyond the one he'd already paid by tending the boy's arm and accepting the woman's water. He saddled his horses just after 9 in the morning and brought them to the gate and stood there for a long time looking at the flat expanse to the south where the Perdido Basin shimmered in the early heat. The hills to the west were dark and still. The light was not yet high enough to see into their folds and shadows. Anything could have been in those hills, and there would have been no way of knowing it from the gate of this ranch. He unsaddled his horses again. He told himself it was because the young man needed one more day of careful watching before the fever broke entirely, and this was partly true. He told himself it was because the route through the Perdido was not the only route south, and the delay was manageable. This was also partly true. What he did not tell himself, because it was not the kind of thing he said even to himself, was that he could not put his back to those hills and ride away when he knew there was someone watching those hills from a house full of people who had given him their water. He spent the morning shoring up what could be shored up. He moved the horses from the corral to the stable and blocked the stable doors with the heavy timber crossbrace. He checked the shutters on the windows of the main house and found 2 that had loose pins, and he refixed them with shorter pins that could be dropped from inside. He loaded his rifle and leaned it against the wall beside the door. Vera watched all of this without comment. Then she went and got her own rifle and checked the load and set it on the table where she could reach it from the kitchen.
They did not speak about what they were preparing for. They both knew there was a possibility it was nothing, that the lone print at the gate was a curious traveler, that Cutter Voss was somewhere far south and moving away. In this country, fear could run from shadows with no shape to them. But there was a difference between fear and observation, and observation had given them enough to work with. In the early afternoon, Tomas went to the doorway and stood there looking west toward the hills for a long time without speaking. Then he said quietly, "Someone is up there." Caleb came and stood beside him. The hills were a mile away, maybe a little more. Low desert hills, brown and red, cut through with arroyos and scrub. In the full light of midday, nothing moved. "What makes you say that?" Caleb asked. "The birds," said Tomas. "They stopped singing an hour ago. Everything over that way, nothing moves. When men go into a place, everything gets quiet around them like that. You learn to notice." Caleb had noticed. He had been waiting to see if the boy noticed too. "Yes," he said. "Someone is up there." They watched the hills through the afternoon. The light moved, the shadows shifted, and the absence of bird sound continued unbroken. Twice Caleb thought he caught movement on the highest ridgeline, a dark shape, still as a planted stake, that was either a rock formation or a man on horseback who was very good at not moving. The shape was there, and then it was not there, and he could not be sure of what he'd seen. What he was sure of was the feeling that pressed behind his sternum in a slow and steady way. Not panic, not dread, something more like the awareness of being known, being located, being counted. They were out there. He did not know how many. He did not know what they wanted. He did not know if they would come tonight, or the night after, or the night after that, or if they would simply wait until the will of the people inside wore thin, and something small and necessary, a trip to the well, a walk to the stable, gave them the opening they needed. That uncertainty was, he understood, entirely deliberate. The night passed without incident. The second night also passed without incident. It was the waiting that did things to a person. Caleb had slept in contested country enough times to know that sustained alertness carried a cost that mounted slowly, the way debt mounts, not visible day to day, but suddenly enormous when the full accounting came. He slept in 2-hour intervals, rising to check the perimeter, listening to the particular music of the desert dark, which has its own grammar of sound and pause that a careful man could read like a page. Vera slept less than he did. He would wake for his checks and find her already sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, her hands wrapped around a cup that had long since gone cold. They talked on the second night, not about the riders or the hills or the question of what was coming. They talked the way people talk when the subject underneath is too large and immediate to address directly, around it, through it, without ever landing on it. She'd come to this land with her husband 12 years ago. He died of a fever in the 4th year, leaving her the ranch and a small debt and the kind of solitude that settles on a person like dust and eventually becomes indistinguishable from who they are. She had made it work through the same qualities that kept her alive in this present situation: stubbornness, accuracy, and an absence of self-pity so complete it had begun to look like serenity. "You could have left already," she said to him at one point. It was not an accusation, it was an observation, delivered with the directness she applied to everything. "I could have," he agreed. "Why didn't you?" He thought about this. "Because you gave me your water when you didn't have enough to give, and because there's no road south that I'd feel easy walking until I knew how this sorted out." She looked at him for a long moment. "You might regret that." "Might," he said, "but I'd regret the other thing more." She nodded slowly and looked back at her cup. Outside, somewhere in the middle distance, a coyote called once and went quiet, and neither of them spoke for a long while after. On the third morning, the riders came down from the hills.
There were 7 of them. They came at a walking pace, spread in a loose line, moving out of the arroyos at the base of the western hills and across the flat toward the ranch. They made no effort at concealment. They came the way men come when they want to be seen coming, which told Caleb something important. They were not making a raid. They were making a statement. The approach itself was the first move of a longer game. He watched them from the gap between the shutters for a long time before anyone spoke. Vera stood at the other window. Tomas was in the back room, away from the windows, at Caleb's instruction. The riders stopped 50 yards from the gate, 7 horses in a loose crescent facing the house, 7 men who sat easy in their saddles, unhurried, as though they had arrived at a place they were entirely sure of and had all the time in the world. The one in the center was different from the others. Caleb could see it even at distance, the way the other men angled slightly toward him when they stopped, a small orbital gravity of deference. He was average in height, gray-hatted, with a horse a shade lighter than the others, and on his left cheek, even at 50 yards, the pale crescent of an old scar caught the morning light. Cutter Voss sat his horse in the middle of the crescent and looked at the house for a very long time without speaking. Then he called out, "Mornin'." His voice was not large. It did not need to be. There was no wind. Caleb did not respond immediately. Voss was not speaking to get an answer. He was speaking to measure the delay. Caleb went to the door and opened it part way and stood in the opening with his rifle at his side, muzzle down. "Mornin'," he said. Voss looked at him for a moment. "Didn't expect a man," he said. "Heard there was just a woman holding this ranch." "Heard wrong." A small pause. Voss's eyes moved across what was visible, the door, the window shutters, the stable, reading the way a careful man reads a landscape. "We're passing through," Voss said, "looking to water our horses. Long ride from the north." Caleb looked at 7 horses and 7 men and thought about the well that had already lost a hand's width to him and the 2 horses he'd watered 3 days ago. He thought about Vera saying she had enough and about the count of days since the last rain. "Well's low," he said. "We can give each animal a single bucket. That's what we've got." Something moved through Voss's face. Not anger, more like the registering of a variable he hadn't expected. He glanced briefly at the man to his right and then back at Caleb. "A single bucket, 7 animals. That's what we can spare."
Another pause, longer this time. The line of riders was very still in the morning heat, their horses standing without restlessness in the disciplined way of animals ridden hard by experienced men. "All right," said Voss finally. "We'll take what you're offering." He said it pleasantly, which was worse than if he'd said it with anger. Anger could be measured. Pleasantness, in a man like Voss, was a door left open on a dark room. The shape of what was inside was hidden, but the opening was there. Caleb walked them through it carefully. He brought them to the well 2 at a time, never more, keeping himself and the rifle present, in the house at his back. Vera watched from the window. Tomas did not appear. The horses drank their single buckets and stood with their heads low, not satisfied, the way animals are when they've been given a taste of what they needed, but not the full measure of it. Voss watched Caleb throughout this process with the kind of attention that is not obviously attention, looking at the horizon, at the stable, at the ground, but always returning to him with the patient sweep of a man making a study. When the last horse was watered, Voss walked to the well himself and looked down into it. The water level was low. He could see it without measuring. "You gave a man water a few days ago," he said, without looking up from the well. "Young man, Mexican, came through here alone." Caleb said nothing. "That man," said Voss, still conversational, still looking at the water, "worked a claim that belongs to people I work for. He and the men with him were there without authorization. They were run off, and he is not supposed to be in this basin." He turned and looked at Caleb then, direct and without mask. "I'd like to speak with him," he said. The morning heat pressed down on the yard. Behind Caleb the house was silent. He thought of Tomas in the back room with his healing arm and his borrowed safety, and he thought about the 2 men who had not run, and the Beaumont ranch left empty to the north, and the Kellermans south of here the same. "There's nobody here but me and the woman," Caleb said. Voss looked at him for a long moment. His expression did not change. He was a man who had sat at this table before, across from many different kinds of people, and he knew how to read what was given and what was withheld. "All right," he said again. He put on his hat and turned back to his horse. His man watched without expression. He mounted and looked down at Caleb from the saddle. "We'll be in the basin a few more days, resting up. Might come back through." He said it the same way a man says "good morning," pleasantly, in passing, as though it meant nothing at all. Then he turned his horse and rode, and his men fell in behind him in a loose line, heading back toward the hills, and Caleb stood at the gate and watched them go with the rifle loose in his hand, and the well 20 yards behind him, and the knowledge sitting in him like a coal that had not yet shown its heat. They would come back. He knew it the way he knew the feel of weather before it broke, not from evidence he could name,
but from the accumulated understanding of a man who had lived a long time in country that punished the inattentive. They would come back, and when they did, they would not come asking.
He told Vera everything that afternoon. She listened without interruption. When he was finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He knows Tomas is here." "Yes." "He's giving us a day to hand him over?" "That's how it reads." She looked at the wall. "And if we do?" Caleb did not answer that, because there was nothing to say that would improve on the question. Tomas was in the kitchen. He had heard everything from the doorway, the way he had a habit of appearing at doorways when what mattered was being said. He stood there now with his bandaged arm and his quiet face, and he said, "I can go." "You won't go," said Vera, without looking at him. "It is my problem," said Tomas. "I brought this here." "You came here on foot with a fever and a dirty wound," she said. "You didn't bring anything here that wasn't already moving through this basin." "She's right about that," said Caleb. "Voss wasn't stopping at this ranch because of you. He was going to stop here one way or another. You just gave him a reason to arrive with questions instead of fire." Tomas looked at both of them. "Then what do we do?" What they did was think and plan and work and wait. Caleb sent Tomas to the stable to prepare the 3 horses, Caleb's 2 and the small mare Vera kept, with saddlebags and water enough for 3 days, placed so they could be ready to ride in minutes. He set up a position at the 2 best angled windows so that the approaches to the house could be watched at any hour. He found an old hand mirror in Vera's things and rigged it to a post at the south end of the yard, angled so that movement from the western approach would catch the light before any rider got within close range. He showed Vera how to use the signal fire, a specific triple arrangement of the available brush and dry wood in the stone fire ring east of the house, which, if lit, would send a smoke column visible for 15 miles in clear weather. Whether anyone was close enough to see it and act on it was an unknown. In this country, unknowns were the currency you spent when you had nothing else. The day passed. The sun moved. The hills to the west held their silence. That night, Caleb told Vera something he had not told her before. He told her that 3 years ago, he had been in a situation not entirely different from this one, on the New Mexico side, when a dispute over a water right had turned into 3 days of siege at his small homestead. He told her that the siege had ended badly, not for the people in the house, but for the one wrong decision that got made in the final hour, when exhaustion and fear had worn the margins too thin. "What was the decision?" she asked. "Trying to negotiate when the time of negotiating was over," he said. "When men like Voss come the second time, they've already made their decision. The conversation is just performance." She absorbed this. "So when they come, we don't let them set the terms." "Not attack," he said. "Position. There's a difference." He explained what he had in mind. It was not a grand plan. It was the kind of thing a man makes from what is available: terrain, timing, and the one advantage that the defenders of any place hold over the people coming to take it, which is that they know the ground. He went to sleep for 4 hours and woke to Vera at the table with her lamp and her cold coffee, right on schedule.
They came on the 4th night. Not 7 riders, 9. 2 had been added, which meant Voss had sent for reinforcements in the day that passed, which meant he had taken the refusal seriously. That was, in a sideways way, a form of respect. They came at the hour before false dawn, which is the darkest hour, the one when the body's attention sags lowest. They came without lanterns, spreading in a wide arc that tried to ring the south and west sides of the property, moving slowly across the flat with the patience of men who had done this kind of thing in the dark before. What they did not know was that Caleb was not in the house. He had been outside for 2 hours, in the arroyo that cut along the eastern fence line, 40 yards from where 3 of the riders had to cross to close their arc. He had gone out in the deep dark, moving low and without light,
and settled into the arroyo's shadow with his rifle and his patience and the kind of cold, careful quiet that is not the absence of fear, but the management of it. He let them get close. He fired once into the dirt 5 feet in front of the lead rider's horse. The report in the dark was enormous. All 9 horses shied violently, 2 of them pitching their riders to the ground, and the entire formation dissolved in a chaos of rearing animals and shouted curses in the flat black night. Caleb worked the lever and fired again into the ground, again ahead of the horses, and the sound of it scattered what remained of the ark into separate panicking fragments. From inside the house, Vera fired once through the open shutter, high and deliberate, into the air above the western approach. Tomas lit the signal fire. The column of smoke would mean nothing in the dark. Caleb had told them both this. But the fire itself, the sudden orange column of it blooming against the desert dark, changed what the riders were seeing, changed the calculation. 9 men in the dark surround a quiet house differently than 9 men in the dark surround a burning signal and a rifle in an arroyo they cannot locate. Voss called out from somewhere in the dark. His voice was controlled, but it carried something it had not carried in the daylight meeting at the gate, something that was very close to uncertainty. "You've made a mistake," he called. Caleb did not respond. He moved 50 feet down the arroyo in absolute silence and listened to the shapes of the dark around him. "There's 9 of us," Voss called, "and there will be more. You can't hold this place." He was right about that, and he was wrong about it simultaneously. You cannot hold a place against attrition in numbers if you are committed to holding the place. But Caleb was not committed to holding the place. He was committed to surviving it. He moved to the stable, staying below the fence line. The horses were ready. He gave a low, specific whistle, the signal he had drilled Vera and Tomas on twice the day before, and waited. 60 seconds later, the stable door opened from the inside. Vera came out first with her rifle and her saddlebag, then Tomas with the reins of all 3 horses, moving in a low crouch across the 20 feet of open yard to the stable's shadow, and then through the gap in the east fence that Caleb had cut 2 days earlier and quietly widened in the night. They moved east on the horses at a slow walk for a quarter mile below the arroyo line in a direction that Voss and his men had not covered. Then they crossed the hard pan at a canter, and then at a run, the dark desert flying under them, the stars enormous and cold above, the orange point of the signal fire shrinking behind them until it was indistinguishable from any other fixed light in the world. Voss and his men found an empty ranch at sunrise. No bodies, no confrontation, no resolution of the kind Voss had come for. Only a house with cold coffee on the table, a well almost dry, and a single-point fire ring in the yard still putting a thin gray column into the morning air.
They rode for 2 days without stopping beyond what the horses required. They reached a settlement on the edge of the Santa Cruz River, not large, but large enough to have a deputy and a telegraph office, and they told the deputy what they knew about Cutter Voss and the Beaumont Ranch and the Kellerman family. The deputy wrote it down and sent it over the wire and told them he couldn't promise much, but he'd seen it before when enough reports stacked up from enough places that somebody with the authority to act had to start paying attention. He looked at Tomas. "You'll need to stay and make a statement." "He'll stay," said Vera, before Tomas could answer. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, with the end of the conversation built into the beginning of it. The deputy looked at Caleb. "You too." Caleb thought about El Paso and the surveyor's satchel and the land company waiting on documents that were already 4 days overdue. He thought about the contract and the pay and the route south that had been the whole beginning and end of his concern when he first saw a smoke column 3 days' ride north of here. "I'll stay," he said. He did not send word to the land company, and they were not pleased about it, and he lost the contract over it, which cost him enough money to matter in a lean season. But he had looked at Vera and Tomas in a deputy's office making a statement about the people who had taken the Beaumonts and the Kellermans, and the cost of the other choice,
The route south, the documents delivered on time, the quiet departure from a ranch that had given him its water, that cost he could not have carried the same way. The deputy's reports, stacked with several others from other settlements, eventually moved a federal marshal to run down Cutter Voss 6 weeks later near the Arizona-Sonora line. 3 of his men were taken. 4, including Voss himself, were not. The question of what happened to the Beaumont family was never fully answered. The Kellermans were found alive in Sonora. They had fled south ahead of Voss and been too afraid to come back. They came back eventually. Vera returned to the ranch. She had not considered any other possibility. Caleb rode with her as far as the Rincon foothills, where the land flattened again into the long approach he had first ridden 3 weeks before, following a smoke column that had not been his business. They stopped where the trails split, his route south, hers west. She did not say thank you, and he did not expect her to. It was not the way she was built. The well will need time before the rains come. I know it, she said. Tomas will be a fair hand if you want to keep him on, once the arm's fully healed. She looked at the horizon. I might. He tipped his hat and turned his horses south. He rode for an hour before he stopped on a low rise and looked back the way he'd come. The ranch was invisible from here, swallowed by distance and the earth's own flatness. The hills to the west were just hills from this angle, brown, still, indifferent, giving nothing away. He turned south again.
A man carries the decisions he makes in this country the same way he carries water, carefully, knowing the weight of it, knowing that what he shares cannot always be reclaimed, and knowing that the giving or the withholding defines, in ways that don't announce themselves until later, what kind of person is walking around in his skin. He had shared his last water once, on a morning when he hadn't meant to stop. The rest had followed from that. In this country, it usually does.